Hello, everyone. I am with Mary Antonia Wood, and Mary is the chair of the Depth Psychology and Creativity program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And Mary is also the author of The Archetypal Artist, Reimagining Creativity and the Call to Create. So welcome, Mary.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you again.
Mary, we've had a couple of conversations before, and somewhere today we were talking about, in the context of creativity, we were going to take up two people, Michael Tucker and his book, Dreaming with Open Eyes. And then we were going to talk about Gloria Anzaldua at some stage and her book. Well, she has a few books, but Borderlands is the one I've most recently read. Which I loved. And I just want to ask you, so that we can start, why is the figure of the shaman so important for artists and creative people today? Why?
Michael, I'm looking at my Michael Tucker's book here.
Yeah.
You know, Michael Tucker probably said it best, in that the shaman is the archetypal ancestor of the creative individual, of the artist across disciplines. He makes some very convincing points with his research into both history and lives, biographies of artists throughout history, focusing on contemporary artists, 20th century artists. But what he finds is this parallel of a patterning of an initiatory event, what he calls a initiatory illness, which earlier scholars used somewhat different wording for. But in the years that I've been deeply concerned with what makes an artist, what is the role of an artist in our society today? What role did the creative person serve throughout history? Well, that role intersects with a healer, the medicine person, the shaman, the word that we have come to use that encompasses that sort of person. But the shaman was and is, this is a very much of a living tradition. And I always try to separate those two, the shaman per se, and the shamanic sensibility. But that person felt a responsibility to their community.
Yeah. The health of the tribe is the way it's sometimes described, isn't it? Like concerned with the health of the tribe.
The health of the tribe. So let me, before giving you a little bit from Tucker, let me step back a bit, because as we were beginning, preparing for this conversation, I mentioned that it was an interesting synchronicity for me to see this thread so prominently in the works of three scholars, three that I have used sometimes together, but mostly individually in my own writing and teaching. And the first is Henri Ellenberger, who wrote a very definitive study on the history and evolution of what we now call depth psychology. He calls it dynamic psychiatry, and the title of the book is The Discovery of the Unconscious.
Mary, just a quick question about him. Was he around? I know very little about him, and was he around at the time of Jung, or was he a contemporary? Were they mates, as we say here, or?
I don't think they were friends or familiars. And to tell you the truth, I do not know if they were contemporaries in age. This study by Ellenberger was written in the 70s, so a decade after or more after Jung was gone.
Yeah.
So to step back just a little bit, prior to Tucker, 20 years prior to Tucker's ideas, Ellenberger offers a statement that a phrase that he coined called creative illness.
Mm.
And as a way to define this, he says that it occurs in various settings across cultures and is found among shamans, mystics of various religions, philosophers, creative writers. But he's writing this in the context of talking about both Freud and Jung and their biographies. Both of them, if you know a little bit, and I know your listeners do, about their lives, they both had these deep descents, very troubling times in their lives. And Ellenberger
Which, you know, creative illness can be a kind of a nice way to put it in terms of, sometimes the gravity, like, of the situation with Jung. It was that, like, it wasn't a small thing what he went through, was it?
Not at all. And Ellenberger describes this quite powerfully as a period of intense preoccupation. He calls it a polymorphic condition, many sided condition that can include depression, neurosis, psychosomatic ailments, deep suffering. It's a period of suffering. What he finds, though, if one survives this, comes out the other end, is that it can be tremendously transformative. It can set the tone. It can define and clarify a mission, a destiny for that person for the rest of their life. And we see that in Jung and in his own words, in his memoir, when he talks about that period of his quote unquote confrontation with the unconscious, which Ellenberger describes as Jung's creative illness, where that experience was the foundation for all of his theorizing.
And later works, if we could put it that way. I mean, it came from that period. And Jung is, like, Jung, I remember the first time I saw him, there was a BBC interview, and I didn't know anything about Jung. I was very young when I saw it somewhere. And I thought, wow, this guy's wild. He's like some old shaman figure to me. That was my first impression of that. I don't know, there's just that quality about the way he was speaking or whatever. But it's like that. I remember also reading with Sonu Shamadasani and Hillman, Lament of the Dead. Those, you know, Hillman says Jung, what is it? He brought back the voices of the dead, of the ancestors, or he opened the mouth of the ancestors, or something like that. So it's kind of got that. There's a shaman who died in 1960, if you want to put it that way.
Well, and there have been at least a handful of books and other studies comparing Jung himself to a shaman-like figure. I'm sure you've come across those, your listeners have. And there's a place in Jung's collected works where he's discussing his theory of the mana, M-A-N-A, the mana personality, as someone shaman-like, someone with a captivating, transformative power, almost bewitching, who is able to heal, to offer new insights, to be a co-creator in reality, and someone who exudes this kind of power. And as part of that passage, Jung likens the position of the analyst as someone who is embodying that mana personality, which is part of the healing, the analysand, the patient, the one that is suffering, that is looking for insight, for relief, trusts that person, feels that power coming from that individual.
And I think if you know, like, it's a strange calling, isn't it, towards the creative? I mean, we live in a world of economics or whatever, and it's like, when one maybe first hears a little call to whatever level, you know, we hear that call towards the creative. It's a strange thing, and that's why I like all this, because it gives some background context that so many people and the Jungs of the world and way back have been through some kind of process. Because I remember when I first started writing something, someone said, you know, someone in my kind of extended family said, but how much money do you make out of writing? You know, but it's like, and at the time you're very, what is it? Alone and in the dark, because there's not a lot of support for that kind of thing. So it's kind of like you've got to reach back into a tradition, or to me, that's what you're saying. It's like,
Yes,
if one understands a tradition, you get some source of support from it.
It's tremendously supportive, and I have seen artists and creative people that I work with in my personal practice, in my teaching, who once they discover this thread, this ancestral patterning, this lineage that they feel called to, everything sort of falls into place. It's not like things get easier, but they are strengthened, they're ennobled. They feel like they have finally had this clarified, this quite difficult path that has called them.
And maybe not something you'd consciously choose, because you might consciously choose to be a lawyer and make $1 million a year or something like that.
Yes, and many times people will live a life of filled with career, filled with family, doing things that perhaps brought them material gain, brought them pleasure, brought them status, but there's always that, you know, that nagging something that is there that continues to call them. And I think that is one of the reasons that we see people in midlife and later
make big changes,
making those big changes and deciding that, yes, they will devote the rest of their life to this calling in as many ways as they can.
Mary, and I just want to mention one other thing, is that one thing I got from your book is that the original shaman, the ancestral shaman, the archetypal shaman, or way back, someone like a Heraclitus, the poet, the seer, the philosopher, and I think you said something like, you know, in his time, he would have been known as a physician too, Heraclitus. So it's like, there wasn't that, what's the word? Separation that we have.
Separation, yes, and the specialization. Yeah, some of the best and most exciting research that I did for that book concerned going back and looking at both historical record and mythic tales of this sort of united figure, this multifaceted figure who existed. In the Western tradition, this would be pre-Socratic. There were individuals who could be mistaken for any of those professions that we've divided them.
I mean, you just wouldn't know with Heraclitus, would you? Is he a poet? Is he a philosopher? I mean, you know, he's all of the above.
And there was a shamanic tradition in Greece, and many of those, the exchange that happened in the Middle East between ideas and religions and ritual and so forth from the East, from the Far East, that was meeting those same ideas and traditions and ceremonies from the Mediterranean in the Middle East. So in those courts, you could have an exchange of the most interesting ideas, the most profound ideas from a variety of cultures. And yes, the physician, the philosopher, the poet, the
seer,
this seer, yes,
seer.
The same figure. And the medicine, if you will, that they would dispense could be music. It could be a song. It could be a story. It could be a ritual that would be prescribed. Dreams. It could be the incubation of a dream. So that's another very interesting thing about the Ellenberger study, is that he makes some of these connections between very archaic, like healing practices, spiritual practices, and some parallels to contemporary depth psychological healing practices. He doesn't do as much with the artist, and that is where, although he mentions the creative figure and the artist, but that is where Tucker's book really shines, his book from the 1990s.
I've got something from Tucker, Mary. The prehistoric shaman remains the archetype of all artists. Image maker, dancer, drummer, actor, and singer, healer and holy one. The shaman epitomizes the human need to bridge worlds, to fly beyond the everyday of the visual, and to conjure worlds of visionary presence and power.
Yeah, isn't that a stirring passage?
It
I mean,
is.
it just really, if you have any intimations, I think that this might be your calling, that there might be something more to being a creative person than self-expression, than realizing forms of things that are already known, representing forms of things that are known, that there is a deeper, very profound, a sacred, it really is a sacred calling. Of course, one could read that paragraph and not have it touch you deeply, but I've found that that is from Tucker's preface, that many of the creative people I work with, coming across that is an epiphany. It's a revelation for them, but it's also a reminder of a deep knowing that they already have, but perhaps have never really been able to articulate.
Yeah. Understanding the calling. You know, I don't know whether I mentioned this to you before, but there was a man in Australia, he's died now, but he was an Aboriginal man. And there is what's known as the song man in Aboriginal culture. And he was known as a song man, whatever. But what he did was he started something called the Bangarra Dance Company. And so it was traditional, like he was drawing on the traditional essence, but it was done through contemporary dance. Like it was a hit. People love the Bangarra dance. But it's kind of it shows you that meeting of the old and the new. He was, to me, he was doing that old role of the shaman, but putting it in such a contemporary context.
A couple of people who had spoken along those same lines are Mircea Eliade, the great religious studies scholar. He wrote a piece on Brancusi, and then another one called The Sacred and the Modern Artist, with that very same sentiment that contemporary art can reach back into, tap into something, can express the same sort of very profound sacrality that what we call archaic or ancient art had, but doing it in a contemporary way for contemporary people. It's not trying to recreate something or pretending to be an archaic person from the past. It's absolutely meeting the needs of your time, but bringing up those same deep feelings, communal feelings.
Old wine in new bottles, as Jung called it, something like that. But just off on another side, Mary, sometimes I think someone like a Vincent van Gogh, there's something shamanic about him, isn't there? Because it's kind of like, I think Herbert Reed said art makes you feel something. And just to look at a Vincent van Gogh painting somehow takes you into the animundi, takes you into the world alive, or gives some sense of it's almost different cosmology or something, isn't it? Really, it's kind of like or the you know what I mean? It's that's the power of art to transform. That's the and you could say that's kind of like being a shaman. Yeah.
Yes, I'm thinking to some statements that Michael Tucker includes from 20th century jazz artists about what they do and why they do it. And it is the shamanic pattern is shown in the fact that they have felt that they have traversed worlds, that they have somehow moved from this ordinary reality that we are all in to some other reality.
Mhm.
And they've come back with something.
Yeah.
And their greatest gift is to shape that something into music, into a song. And visual artists have articulated that in very similar ways, that it's their deepest desire to somehow share what they've experienced. The fact that they allow a sort of ego death, and we've talked about that with Rosemary Gordon's work in the Jungian, parallels much of what we're talking about today. This surrender and allowance of softening of the ego enough to become a medium, an instrument, a channel, and then bringing some of those wonders back and shaping it in a way that people can receive it and share a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering whether we can maybe move on to Gloria Anzaldua. And firstly, why do you choose her? What do you like about Gloria in the context of what we're talking about?
Yeah. Let me tell you, I'll give you a brief little bio about Anzaldua for your listeners. Gloria Evangelina Anzaldua was a just incredible, unique, multifaceted person. The way she described herself was as a queer, mestiza, theorist, artist, activist, educator, and sometimes there were even more roles. But she grew up in a farm working family on the border of the US and Mexico. Her family had lived in that area for some generations. Her heritage is quite a mix of indigenous and European Spanish heritage. Her last name is a Basque name. And she faced many, many challenges growing up, not having the funds to attain the kind of education that she craved and longed for. She was a voracious reader. She was an incredible writer, even as a middle school student, a high school student. In fact, she was accused of plagiarizing by some of her teachers because she was such a brilliant thinker and writer. And it was unexpected for this young woman from a farm working family. Through her college years, she worked during the day. She went to school at night. She had to quit her graduate education at least a couple of points because she just couldn't afford it. She had to work full time. She faced many health challenges, including diabetes, which eventually was the cause of her early death. She died in 2004, so it's been 20 years now, at age 62. Wow. So that is quite tragic, and I'm sure there would have been even more from her had she had an additional 20 years. But she was, she became very influential in these interlocking worlds of gender studies, Latino studies, in university settings, in colleges, but somewhat unknown to artists and creators. You know, she was an activist. She worked very closely with social justice issues, especially with opening up opportunities for people of color, especially Latinas. So what I find in her, beyond her renown in those worlds, is that she is a depth psychological thinker. She is even though she's gone, her voice is a very important voice for reimagining, for keeping fresh, for revivifying depth psychological thought, particularly around creativity and the role of the artist. So that's a little bit about her. Your listeners can find a lot about her just getting online.
You know, to me, she's doing a dance between, she's an intellectual, you know, and she's understands contemporary thought, you know, she's a scholar or whatever. And then she's bringing in this older language. And I think she said somewhere, I'm trying to remember, but it was something like, you know, I come from a culture where there were still spirits in the wind or something like that. So she's, I think it's a bit magical the way she's dancing between those two worlds. And I love it when she uses some of the old Spanish terms, the whatever, and it kind of somehow takes you into that world which has spirit. You know, like, I mean, this is off on a bit of a track, but say with an Isabel Allende, the House of Spirits or whatever, you get a bit of the House of Spirits with Gloria. Yeah. But you get solid scholar, solid intellect, kind of. They both have it.
Absolutely. Yeah, she is a formidable scholar, philosopher, who really hasn't gotten her due. But she's also this trickster, this sort of heretic and risk taker, in that she brings in not only the Spanish, she translates some of it, but not all of it.
Not all of it, yeah.
Expects that she can bring in all of herself into her scholarship, into her art, into activism. She brings her spirituality into academic or intellectual discourse, into her writing. She brings in, again, her heritage, the myths of her many cultures, particularly the Mesoamerican myths and stories are very prominent. So I find her, I think of her as a model, as an inspirational model for how one can bring their whole person into not only an academic setting, which she railed against throughout her career. She really did not want to be, and she couldn't be penned
the dry academic, specialized academic or whatever.
Or to fit into that mold, or to put some of herself aside to be this objective academic kind of teacher.
It's very courageous, really, isn't it, to bring all of yourself in?
It was very courageous, and she came up against much.
She would have come across some old timers along the way, I'd imagine, that didn't like, didn't think that was appropriate.
Yes, yeah, she had a lot of issues with this, but she was persistent. She was not going to diminish herself. There are places in her writing where she talks about being fine with being very poor, with feeling hungry.
But she's hungry to write too. I mean, when you read about when she's like, I put on Substack not so long ago the beginning of one of her books, why she writes. It's like she has to write. She's not just doing it for some, just to have some fun on a Sunday afternoon or something like that. It's like she has to do it.
That was her primary mode of living. That's how she came to know things. There are places in her writing where she'll say, I don't enter my writing knowing what I'm going to write about. And she wrote voluminous amounts of things. She would do preliminary notes. She would do free writes. She would do multiple drafts of anything she wrote and really get in there with the editing. So that was her passion, her obsession.
So, when we've spoken along the way, Mary, you sometimes talk about multiplicity. So we can say she's, bringing, you've mentioned already, she's bringing in different kinds of things, isn't she? But what is multiplicity? Why do you think it's important, you personally?
I think it is the natural way of being human. I think we're all multiple, but that is something that is sort of pounded out of us, or we're convinced that we're not. We're pushed into being a specialist of some kind or another. It's a much richer way to live. It's a way that one can contribute in ways that are not possible if you only imagine yourself as a specialist. So she is a model of multiplicity. Someone who was a visual artist, someone who was an activist, scholar, teacher, and from all accounts of those who have written about her since her passing, and even beforehand, the scholars and friends that knew her describe her as an amazing and caring friend, and someone who kept deep connections with her family as well. So she moved between these worlds. She had a somewhat shamanic life, and she would describe it that way. One of her main theories is this idea of Nepantla, which is a indigenous word, a Mixtecan word, the Nahuatl language for a middle place. It's about a liminal place between worlds. She literally was that. She could have a foothold in various worlds, but one side of that is that she never felt fully comfortable in any world or fully accepted. There was always some longing or something lacking, but it actually gave her, she calls it was one of her greatest powers, is to be able to move around that middle space, be a bridge, and bring worlds together.
And she can take you into that feeling of liminality. Again, if art makes you feel, reading Gloria makes you feel liminal, because she's negotiating those passages.
There's a place, you're probably thinking about Light in the Dark, Luz en lo Oscuro, Rewriting Identity, Spirituality and Reality. It's the last book that was published with her writings. It was compiled by a dear friend of hers, another incredible scholar, Ana Louise Keating, who is probably the foremost scholar working with Anzaldua's ideas still today. But yes, that book is like stepping into a sort of magic spell. There's a place early in the book where Anzaldua says that she doesn't want to talk about images. She wants to write with them. She wants to actually bring one into the imagination and not just talk about it.
Yeah. And I feel she succeeds at doing that. You know, she does, and it comes through, but it hasn't been without its creative illness. You get that sense too, the what she's been through along the way. You know, you wouldn't say, just as a reader, you wouldn't say, well, it's necessarily been an easy journey, but it's brought some wonderful fruit, some wonderful treasure.
Yes, and her own, if we can use the phrase creative illness again, at a very early age, very early, she started puberty, like at 3 or 4 years old, in a very unusual condition. So she suffered with that for decades. That alongside the diabetes and the other complications. So that is another place where she mirrors this shamanic pattern of an initiatory illness into something that became her destiny.
Yeah. Well,
I find it very, very relatable, because I think we all have our wounds, and she finds power in woundedness. That wounds can be openings. Like Hillman says, a wound can be an eye. It's a way of seeing. It's a way of deepening one's compassion. You know, the wounded healer.
It's the right title, isn't it? From the dark to the light. There's someone prepared to have gone through the dark, even in the writing style. You know, it's not as if she's saying, oh, I just captured this incredible inspiration or something like that. It's like she's going through the dark, and then the light's emerging as you go, you know, as you walk along.
And her life is so close to ours. You know, she's only been gone for 20 years. It's not like Jung, who's been gone since the 60s. She is also someone from a mix of cultures, not a European scholar, like so many of the depth psychological elders are. So in those ways, she becomes a real inspiration, a model for people, whether it's the woundedness that leads them in, or the fact that she is multicultural, and she brings her full self. Her very honest and open inclusion of her queerness, and her spirituality, all woven into what she presents.
You know, one thing I was thinking of when I was reading it, you know, with I've been thinking lately with Jung and Hillman, like Jung from the Northern European tradition a little more, you know, Goethe and the others, and then Hillman, the lover of Italy. So there's like the North and the South, like, and I was thinking of Hillman as his half Italian, Jung's half Italian brother or something like that, who's, you know, but it's kind of like she's bringing up the South too. You know, there's North America, and she can kind of play that game of North America, if you want to put it that way. But you get the feeling of the South. And I don't know how you pronounce it, but the goddesses, the mother and the daughter.
Yeah, the mother is Coatlicue, the Aztec goddess, the Mixtecan goddess, and then the daughter in that tale is Coyolxauhqui, and she is the moon goddess.
So she, you know, Gloria's always talking about that, those two. And I think the North is scared of the South, you know, in one way, but it's kind of like, as I read, it's like, it's so refreshing when it's like, what is it? We've been so sterilized by the disenchanted worldview and economics that unless a writer can bring in some soul or spirit, you're just not interested in it. You know, it's like you're not getting any nourishment unless someone can really bring in that kind of dimension.
And that is something that both Tucker and Anzaldua emphasize in their works, making this connection between shaman and creative individual and artist, is that that person is a disruptor. And that person leads to or initiates a type of upheaval or even death of the current order in order to open up, make room for the new. You see some of that too in Jung's ideas about the visionary artist in those two essays from his collected works, volume 15, The Spirit in Man, Art and Literature. He talks about visionary art that can rend from top to bottom the curtain upon which the world, our world reality is painted. And that is something that the shamanic sensibility in a creative person can accomplish.
And there's something, I don't really know how to articulate this, but lately, you know, you've got that side of the shaman, as people can understand, the medicine man and the, what is it, the, you know, wise old man from the tribe who speaks, you know, wisdom or whatever. But I think this thing of the trickster that we sometimes, you know, that Lewis Hyde spoke about, and the trickster is shaman. Like, you know, I mean, in a modern context, Billy Connolly and Robin Williams and people like that, you know, like, they're not just the funny men in the sense, they're or the funny people, you know, there are lots of people around like that. But it's kind of like there's also a shamanic role in all of that, in terms of that destruction and renewal that you were talking about, death and renewal.
Yeah, absolutely. Hyde brings that out beautifully, and Trickster Makes This World. I think that's the book that you're referring to. And there is this idea of the sacred fool.
Yeah. So multiplicity, I call it, you know, I think, you know, even in the Odyssey, polytropous, you know, many-sided, many ways. And somewhere I was reading not so long ago, it's a mistake to worship just one God. I think it's linked to that Hillman's idea of polytheism, in the sense that to have some of the different flavors, maybe when you're talking about Gloria, you know, she's open to different gods and goddesses, you know, if you want to put it that way, and she's prepared to bring that into a work rather than just one. It's almost like specialization can kill, really, can't it? It can kill the soul, because it can dry you up.
Absolutely, it can, because you're limiting yourself. You're self-limiting. You're allowing yourself to be limited. One of the things that she pushed back against with such fervor was what she called this sort of sleepwalking that we do, through an idea of a single reality that's been presented to us that we don't question. And that includes the kind of oppressions that are built into that world, racism, and so many of the other sorts of situations that keep certain groups in power, that keep a power structure going, and keep others from opportunity, from power, from imagining. There's a place, and I'm just thinking here too of another theorist who worked at the same time as Anzaldua, and they possibly knew each other. I know that they were at least one conference together on, they were both speakers at a conference here in Santa Barbara, early 2000s, maybe 2000. That was Bell Hooks, the theorist, poet, essayist, activist from here in the US. And as we were just speaking now, I'm thinking about one of her statements that sounds very much like something Anzaldua would say. in that once a people's imagination is thwarted, once it's diminished or dismissed outright, or you convince people that the imagination is something lesser, it's not real, then according to Hooks, the work of the colonizer is halfway there. That is the first major step.
And then the second step maybe is taking the language away, you know?
Yeah.
Which comes soon after.
Yeah. Once the imagination is killed, then it's easier to colonize, to take over, to oppress, to extract.
But I've got something going on at the moment where sometimes I see, you know, I don't want to get too controversial here because but sometimes I see woke culture as a bit mono. You know, it's like a religious group of people speak the same and say the same slogans. And you come, like the other day on Facebook, you know, someone was saying anyone on, you know, I put something there and then someone said, anyone who's not a vegetarian is a murderer of mothers and babies, you know? And I thought, wow, gee, that's a pretty strong thing to say. You know, I was just trying to make a joke or something. So there's kind of like woke culture in its certitude. You know, it's kind of what's right and what's wrong, if you want to put it that way. And then we've got rules and we're living in an upheaval. So people want rules, if you want to put it that way. Whereas I see multiplicity, like we've been talking about with Gloria, there's a person who is open to the different sides of themselves. And I admire her specifically. Not what I'm trying to get at too is there's a couple of things. The artist as a person who changes the world, not just the activist, but I know she was both, right?
Yes.
But there's that thing that we sometimes forget that, you know, maybe Vincent van Gogh has changed the world more than 10,000 political activists. I'm not sure, because he has made people feel something different, you know? So we've got this thing on political activism, which has become a little tight, not loose. And we've forgotten this thing of diversity in the sense of being open to the different planets, the different gods, the different flavors and tastes and styles within ourselves, first and foremost. I don't know. I think I just might have got on a soapbox there for a while.
Well,
you can kick me off that soapbox if you want.
No, I'm, since we're still talking about Gloria Anzaldua and her legacy, I mean, she navigated that with difficulty, not always with grace, but she found herself as this mediator. She found herself in situations that seemed intractable between different sides, and she would do the work of trying to bridge, trying to find openings for conversation, not shutting down one or the other, but holding, we're back to the Jungian idea of holding the tension of opposites. And I think that is something that artists, sincere artists, can do, is to move between these worlds, be a mediator, be a crossroads, be a bridge builder, when we face an abyss. And that is something that she wrote about often. She and Hillman both. You come across this idea of facing an abyss, this chasm, this cavern between, and how can that be navigated and bridged with awareness, compassion. So I see her as, even though she's been gone now for 20 years, as modeling what that might look like. And again, she wasn't a saint. She would be the first to admit that. She made missteps and could be rather harsh in places in her writing. but she's also a wonderful exemplar of
a little like
that.
James Hillman in a way. Like it, you know, he also probably made a few mistakes along the way as well.
Yeah. A few.
Well, that's great, Mary. You know, I wonder, just now that you've had a lot of experience teaching, you know, and you have what is it, Talisman Studio or whatever, creative mentoring, Talisman Creative Mentoring.
Creative mentoring.
And at Pacifica, you teach a lot of people with creativity. What are you learning? You know, as you've got this little sabbatical at the moment, just this few month sabbatical.
Mm-hmm.
What are you thinking about? What are you reflecting on? What have you learned from this experience that you've been having?
What keeps coming up for me, especially in this very precious time of being able to, having the luxury, I'm very grateful for that, having the luxury to step back a little bit, is how easily we can be swept away. How we must keep coming back, keep renewing ourselves, renewing our vows, to just, you know, put it in a very straightforward way. To be a creative person is to, on some level, make a commitment, make a vow to offering yourself to surrender, to be this medium, this channel, this potential bridge, to imagine yourself capable of doing all the things we've just been talking about, but without an inflation. It's not an ego thing.
Yeah.
It's actually the opposite. It's really a death of the ego, a diminishment, a dissolving.
Yeah.
So that is what I keep coming back to, that life is short. Every day, days go by very quickly, and we must be really aware and committed to giving our best in each day to our calling.
Yeah, true. That's a beautiful place to finish. And I want to thank you very much for all of your sharing. And, you know, I spruik your book, The Archetypal Artist. I'm like one of those people at a circus, you know, they're at the front of the tent, and because I've taken, I only spruik a book if I've actually taken something deep from it. And I have, you know, and it's about this tradition of the shaman and many things, you know, and that it's helpful to know, and it's helpful to have that support of knowledge, you know, from a tradition, from the past, and from that. It's not like where people are kind of like, oh, shamans, you know, and it's become a bit hip. It's kind of like something that the soul needs in order to, you know, when you're trying to write something, you have to remember that a lot of people have done this, you know, ancestors from way back.
Yes, yeah, I really wanted it to be both an introduction for people, a reminder for others who already have been circling around these topics, and a touchstone with vast endnotes, a vast bibliography, so people could go directly to, go to Tucker, go to Ellenberger, go to Anzaldua, and make this net of meaning for yourself. But these are the things that have occupied me for so long. You know, as Jung said, those ideas that occupy you have been handed to you. So it feels like a part of my own destiny to have completed that. And who knows what will be next? Probably something in the same group of concerns.
Well, thank you, Mary. And thank you very much.
Thanks, John. It's been a pleasure.